Dr. Elena Vasquez rubbed her tired eyes and took another sip of cold coffee. The night shift at the radio telescope facility in Chile was always quiet, but tonight felt different. She had been working at this remote station for 15 years, listening to sounds from deep space, hoping to find something extraordinary. Most nights brought nothing but static and the usual cosmic background noise. That filled the universe. At exactly 3:47 in the morning, everything changed. The computer screen suddenly came alive with patterns Elena had never seen before. Strange. Signals were coming through the massive dish antenna outside, signals that made her heart race. She leaned forward, adjusting her glasses as she studied the incoming data. This wasn't random noise from a distant star or galaxy. These patterns were too organized, too perfect to be natural. Elena quickly ran through her mental checklist. Maybe the equipment was broken. She spent the next hour checking every connection, every wire, every piece of machinery in the facility. Everything was working perfectly. The signals kept coming, stronger now, as if whatever was sending them knew she was listening. The patterns reminded her of mathematics, but not quite like anything she had studied in school. They were more complex, more beautiful somehow. As she watched the data flow across her monitors, Elena noticed something that made her hands shake. The signals seemed to be responding to the facility's own transmissions. Every time their equipment sent out its regular scanning pulses, these mysterious signals would change slightly, as if answering back. Elena calculated the delay between their signals and the responses. The math was simple, but the result was impossible. Whatever was sending these signals was somewhere in the outer parts of their solar system, about 12 light minutes away from Earth. That meant it was closer than any known planet or large asteroid. But that wasn't the strangest part. Hidden within the mathematical patterns, Elena began to recognize something familiar. Fragments of old television shows from the 1970s were somehow woven into the alien communication. She could make out pieces of commercials, bits of news broadcasts, even parts of cartoons she remembered watching as a child. How could beings from outer space know about Earth television from 50 years ago? Elena looked around the empty facility. She was completely alone, miles from the nearest town. The other researchers wouldn't arrive until morning. She knew she should follow the rules and immediately report this discovery to the international space monitoring organizations. This was exactly the kind of contact scientists around the world had been hoping for. But something held her back. The signals weren't broadcasting to the whole world or even to multiple radio telescopes. They were coming only to this facility, only during her shifts. Elena had worked with the same equipment for years and knew its patterns better than anyone. These signals appeared only when she was alone at the controls. As the hours passed, Elena noticed another disturbing detail. The mathematical sequences in the signals contained numbers that seemed familiar, coordinates that matched her hometown in Argentina, dates that corresponded to important moments in her life, even frequency patterns that somehow reminded her of her grandmother's old lullabies. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold Chilean night. This contact wasn't random. Whatever intelligence was reaching out to Earth wasn't just making contact with humanity in general. They were making contact with her, specifically. She thought about her childhood in rural Argentina, where her grandmother used to tell stories about lights in the sky and visitors who spoke without words. Elena had always assumed these were just old folk tales meant to entertain a curious little girl who loved looking at the stars. But now, sitting alone in this remote facility with impossible signals flowing through her equipment, those old stories didn't seem so imaginary anymore. The signals continued throughout the night, growing stronger and more complex. Elena found herself drawn into the patterns, almost hypnotized by their beauty and precision. She began to feel as if the signals were trying to tell her something important, something personal. But every time she thought she was close to understanding, the meaning slipped away like a half-remembered dream. As dawn approached, Elena faced the biggest decision of her career. She could follow protocol, call the authorities, and let governments and military officials take control of the situation. The discovery would make headlines around the world, but it would no longer be hers to explore. Or she could keep quiet for now and try to understand why these beings from somewhere beyond Earth had chosen to speak specifically to her. The signals felt like a message meant for her eyes only, like a letter addressed to her soul. Elena saved all the data to a secure drive and carefully deleted the official records from the facility's main computers. She would give herself a few days to decode the message before deciding whether to share it with the world. Deep in her heart, she knew this decision would change everything about her life. As the first rays of sunlight touched the mountains around the facility, the signals began to fade. But just before they disappeared completely, Elena could swear she heard something impossible mixed in with the mathematical patterns. It sounded almost like her grandmother's voice, whispering her name across the vast darkness of space. Elena couldn't sleep for 3 days after that night at the telescope. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those mysterious patterns dancing behind her eyelids. The secure drive containing the alien signals felt like it was burning a hole in her desk drawer at home. She had called in sick to work, something she never did. Her supervisor, Dr. Rodriguez, had sounded concerned when she told him she needed a few days off. Elena had been the most reliable researcher at the facility for over a decade, but she couldn't face going back there, not yet. Not until she understood what those signals really meant. In her small apartment overlooking the Chilean mountains, Elena set up her personal computer equipment. She had spent her life savings on high-end analysis software and processors that could handle complex mathematical calculations. Her neighbors probably thought she was crazy, living like a hermit surrounded by humming machines and tangled cables. The first breakthrough came on the second night. Elena was running the signals through a pattern recognition program when she noticed something incredible. The mathematical sequences weren't just random equations. They were using her own brain patterns as some kind of translation key. Elena had participated in a brain imaging study 5 years earlier at the local university. The researchers had been mapping how astronomers' brains process complex data differently from other people. She still had copies of her brain scans stored on an old laptop. When she compared those patterns to the alien signals, the match was almost perfect. Whatever intelligence had sent those signals somehow knew exactly how her mind worked. They had crafted their message specifically to fit the way she processed information. It was like they had studied her thoughts and designed a custom language just for her to understand. But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. As Elena decoded more of the message, she began to recognize fragments of her own memories embedded in the signals. Not just any memories, but deeply personal ones that no one else could possibly know. The scent of her grandmother's kitchen on Sunday mornings, the exact words her father had said to her the night before he died, even the melody of a song she used to hum to herself as a child, a song she had never heard anywhere else. Elena's hands trembled as she worked through the night, uncovering layer after layer of intimate details from her life. How could beings from space know about her private moments? It felt like someone had reached into her soul and borrowed pieces of her past. The breakthrough that changed everything came when she found a reference to her hometown, buried deep in the data. Not just the name of the town, but specific coordinates that pointed to her childhood home. Elena hadn't been back there in over 10 years. Not since her grandmother passed away. Something told her she needed to make that trip. The 8-hour drive through the Argentine countryside gave Elena time to think. She kept asking herself the same questions over and over. Why her? Why now? And how did these visitors know so much about her personal life? Her grandmother's old house sat empty, at the end of a dusty road, surrounded by fields where cattle grazed. Lazily in the afternoon sun, Elena had inherited the property, but never had the heart to sell it. The place held too many memories of summer visits and bedtime stories about mysterious lights in the sky. Elena used her old key to open the creaking front door. The house smelled of dust and old wood, exactly the way she remembered her grandmother's. Furniture was still covered with white sheets, like ghosts waiting patiently for someone to return. In her grandmother's bedroom, Elena found what she was looking for without really knowing she was looking for it. Hidden behind a loose floorboard under the bed was a small wooden box she had never seen before. Inside, wrapped in yellow tissue paper, was her grandmother's private journal. Elena's heart pounded as she opened the leather-bound book. The first entry was dated 1977, the year Elena was born. But what she saw on those pages made her question everything she thought she knew about her family. The journal was filled with the same mathematical patterns Elena had been receiving from space. Page after page of complex equations, star charts, and strange symbols that looked exactly like the alien signals. Her grandmother had been drawing these patterns for decades, long before personal computers or advanced radio telescopes existed. But the journal entries told an even stranger story. Her grandmother wrote about visitors who came to her in dreams, showing her visions of distant stars and other worlds. She described conversations with beings of pure light who spoke directly to her. Mine, most shocking of all, she wrote about a special purpose that would be passed down through their family bloodline. Eleanor read one entry that made her blood run cold. Her grandmother had written about a child who would be born with a special connection to the stars, a child who would one day receive messages from beyond Earth. The description matched Eleanor perfectly, down to her unusual love of mathematics and her ability to understand complex patterns that confused other scientists. According to the journal, her grandmother's mysterious illness in 1977 hadn't been an illness at all. It had been the result of intense contact with these otherworldly visitors. The family had dismissed her strange behavior and talk of celestial visitors as fever-induced hallucinations. But the journal revealed the truth that her grandmother had been forced to keep secret. Eleanor realized that her grandmother had been preparing her for this moment her entire life. All those bedtime stories about lights in the sky hadn't been just entertainment. They had been lessons, carefully disguised as children's tales, meant to prepare Eleanor for the day when the visitors would return. As Eleanor sat in that dusty bedroom, surrounded by decades-old evidence of alien contact, she understood that she wasn't the first in her family to receive these signals. She was simply the next link in a chain that stretched back generations. The visitors hadn't found her by accident. They had been watching her family for decades, waiting for the right moment to make contact. The personal nature of the signals finally made sense. These weren't strangers from another world trying to communicate with humanity. They were old acquaintances of her bloodline, returning to continue a conversation that had been going on long before Elena was even born. Elena decided to stay at her grandmother's house for a few more days. Something about the old place felt different now that she knew its secrets. The creaking floorboards and rustling curtains no longer seemed random. It was as if the house itself was trying to communicate with her. On her second night there, the dreams began. Elena had always been a light sleeper, but these weren't ordinary dreams. They felt more real than her waking hours. In these visions, she found herself floating above Earth, seeing the planet as a tiny blue marble surrounded by infinite darkness. But she wasn't seeing it with human eyes. Her vision could detect colors that didn't exist in the normal world. She could see magnetic fields flowing around the planet like glowing rivers. Radio waves from human civilization appeared as bright threads connecting cities and continents. The experience was overwhelming and beautiful at the same time. But strangest of all, Elena could feel emotions that weren't entirely her own. There was a deep sadness mixed with desperate hope, a longing for connection that stretched across impossible distances, love that had waited centuries to be expressed in the dreams. Elena wasn't alone. She could sense other consciousnesses around her, vast and ancient intelligences that existed in ways she couldn't fully understand. They communicated without words, sharing thoughts and feelings directly from mind to mind. The experience was more intimate than any conversation she had ever had with another human being. These beings showed her glimpses of their existence. They lived in a realm where individual consciousness could merge and separate at will, where knowledge was shared instantly across unlimited space, where time moved differently than it did on Earth, but woven throughout their alien experiences were unmistakably human emotions and memories. Elena saw through their senses as they remembered the taste of her grandmother's homemade bread, She felt their joy when they recalled the sound of children laughing in the streets of her hometown. They carried within themselves fragments of human experience, pieces of life on Earth that they treasured like precious jewels. When Ellen awoke from these dreams, she would find herself crying without understanding why. The emotions from the visions lingered for hours, making her feel homesick for a place she had never been and lonely for companions she had never met in person. During her waking hours, Elena threw herself into researching her family history. She drove to the local library and spent hours digging through old records and newspapers. What she discovered painted a picture that both fascinated and frightened her. Every few generations, women in her maternal bloodline had exhibited unusual abilities. Her great-great-grandmother had been known throughout the region for her uncanny ability to predict weather patterns months in advance. Local farmers would travel for miles to ask for her forecasts, which were always accurate. Elena's great-grandmother had shown an extraordinary talent for mathematics despite never receiving formal education. She could solve complex problems in her head that university professors struggled with on paper. People said she would stare at the night sky for hours, as if she was reading invisible equations written among the stars. Her grandmother's generation had continued the pattern. Besides the journal Elena had found, there were newspaper clippings about her grandmother's mysterious ability to locate lost children and missing livestock. She would often wake up in the middle of the night with precise knowledge of where to find them, as if someone had whispered the information into her dreams. Elena realized that she had inherited more than just mathematical ability from her ancestors. The connection to something beyond Earth ran in her blood like a genetic memory that awakened. When the time was right, the most shocking discovery came when Elena found her grandmother's medical records at the local clinic. The mysterious illness from 1977 had included symptoms that no doctor could explain. Her grandmother had experienced vivid hallucinations of mathematical formulas and star charts. She had spoken in languages that linguists couldn't identify. Most disturbing of all, she had demonstrated knowledge of astronomical events weeks before they were visible from Earth. The doctors had attributed everything to fever and stress. But Elena now understood what had really happened. Her grandmother had been experiencing the same type of contact that Elena was receiving now. The intensity of the experience had been too much for her mind to handle all at once. As Elena studied her grandmother's medical files, she noticed something that made her heart race. The symptoms had begun exactly 9 months before Elena's birth. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Her grandmother's contact with the visitors had somehow influenced Elena's development. Before she was even born, Elena began to suspect that she wasn't just receiving messages from these beings. She was connected to them in a way that went beyond simple communication. The dreams, the inherited abilities in her family, the perfect timing of the contact. It all suggested a relationship that had been carefully planned across multiple generations. But the most unsettling realization came during her 4th night. At the house, as Elena experienced another intense dream vision, she began to understand something that changed everything she thought she knew about the visitors. They weren't entirely alien. Mixed in with their vast, cosmic consciousness were distinctly human thoughts and emotions. They remembered Earth not as outside observers, but as beings who had once lived here. Their knowledge of human culture, their familiarity with Earth's history, their deep emotional connection to human experience. It all made sense if they had once been human themselves. Elena woke from that dream with a terrible understanding. These weren't aliens who had discovered Earth and decided to make contact. They were something much more personal and much more impossible to accept. They were humans from a distant future, transformed by their merger with an ancient alien intelligence. They had evolved beyond their original form, but retained the core memories and emotions that made them recognizably human. And somehow, they had found a way to reach back through time to connect with their own ancestors. Elena was receiving messages from her own descendants, calling to her across centuries of evolution and change. The personal nature of the contact finally made complete sense. These beings knew her intimate memories because they carried those same memories. within their vast collective consciousness. As Elena sat in her grandmother's kitchen, watching the sunrise through the same windows, where her ancestor had received similar visions decades earlier, she understood that she was part of a chain of communication that stretched not just across space, but across time itself. The question that terrified her now was simple. What did they need from her that was so important? They would risk everything to reach back through time to ask for it. Elena's world crashed down around her 3 weeks after returning from her grandmother's house. She had been so careful, so secretive about her discovery, but apparently not careful enough. The knock on her apartment door came at 6 in the morning. Elena opened it to find serious-looking people in dark suits holding official identification from the International Space Monitoring Agency. Behind them stood Dr. Rodriguez, her supervisor from the radio telescope facility, looking embarrassed and worried. "Dr. Vasquez," said the taller agent, "we need to talk about some unusual activity detected at your facility 3 weeks ago." Elena's heart sank. Somehow, they had discovered her unauthorized communications with the visitors from the future. Her careful deletion of the official records hadn't been as thorough as she thought. Within hours, Elena found herself in a sterile conference room at a government building she had never seen before. Officials from multiple countries were connected via video screens around the room. Military advisors whispered urgently in corners. Scientists she recognized from international journals sat at the long table, all staring at her with a mixture of excitement and suspicion. "Dr. Vasquez," said General Harrison, the head of the military delegation, "we have evidence that you've been in contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence. For the past month, you're going to tell us everything." Elena tried to explain that the situation was far more complicated than they understood. These weren't typical aliens planning an invasion or bringing advanced technology. They were human descendants from the future, reaching back through time in a desperate attempt to ensure their own existence. But the officials weren't interested in time travel theories or family connections spanning centuries. They saw only one thing. Elena had made first contact with a non-human intelligence, and they wanted to know how to exploit it. The military officials were the worst. General Harrison kept demanding to know about alien weapons, technology, and defensive capabilities. He wanted Elena to ask the visitors about their military strength and whether Earth was in danger of attack. When Elena tried to explain that these beings were trying to save humanity, not conquer it, he dismissed her concerns as naive. The scientists were almost as frustrating. Dr. Peterson from MIT wanted detailed mathematical proofs of time travel. Dr. Chen from Beijing demanded physical evidence of the alien technology. They treated Elena's personal connection to the visitors as irrelevant, just an unfortunate complication that made their research more difficult. "We need you to reestablish contact immediately," Dr. Peterson explained during one of their endless meetings. "This could be the greatest scientific discovery in human history. We can't let personal feelings get in the way of progress." Elena tried to make them understand that the contact couldn't be forced or controlled. The visitors had chosen to communicate with her specifically because of their family connection across time. They wouldn't respond to demands from government officials or military leaders who saw them only as a potential threat or resource to be exploited. But the officials had made their decision. Elena was moved to a secure facility near the radio telescope in Chile. She was given comfortable quarters and excellent research equipment, but she wasn't allowed to leave. Guards stood outside her door around the clock. Every phone call was monitored. Every email was screened. Think of it as protective custody. General Harrison had said with a smile. That didn't reach his eyes. "We need to keep you safe while you continue your important work for 2 weeks." Elena tried to reestablish contact with her descendants from the future. She sat at the radio controls for hours each day, sending the same mathematical sequences that had worked before. She tried broadcasting during the same times when the original signals had arrived. She even attempted to recreate the exact emotional state she had been in during that first contact. Nothing worked. Elena began to suspect that the visitors were staying silent deliberately. They had somehow detected the change in circumstances and were protecting themselves by cutting off communication. The deeply personal nature of their original contact made sense now. They couldn't risk having their message intercepted by people who might use it for the wrong purposes. On the 15th day of her captivity, something changed. Elena was alone in the communication room during the late night shift when familiar patterns began appearing on her screens. The visitors were trying to contact her again, but the signal was much weaker than before, as if they were struggling to maintain the connection. Elena quickly established communication using the private code she had developed during their earlier exchanges. What she learned in that final conversation changed everything she thought she understood about the situation. The visitors from the future were in terrible danger. Every time they reached back through time to contact someone in the past, they created small changes in the timeline. These changes were accumulating, threatening to erase their entire future existence. They were caught in an impossible paradox. They needed to guide certain events in the past to ensure their own evolution, but their interference was creating alternate timelines that prevented their future from happening. Elena's descendants explained the horrible truth through a flood of images and emotions that brought tears to her eyes. They were already beginning to fade from existence. Each contact with the past weakened their reality a little more. The government interference had accelerated the process by changing the nature of Elena's role. From a willing family connection to a forced scientific experiment, the visitors had a desperate plan, but it required Elena to make an impossible choice. She could accept their guidance and use their advanced knowledge to help humanity evolve in the right direction, but doing so would almost certainly create enough changes in the timeline to erase her descendants' future entirely, or she could reject their contact and let human history proceed naturally. This might preserve their timeline, but it would also mean abandoning the incredible knowledge they were trying to share. Humanity would have to face its uncertain future without the wisdom of its evolved descendants. The choice must be yours. Alone, they communicated to Elena through waves of emotion that felt like her grandmother's gentle voice. We cannot force you to save us if it means sacrificing your own timeline, but we want you to know that we love you across all the years that separate us. You are not just our ancestor. You are the foundation of everything we became. Elena realized that the personal nature of the contact had been more than just a family reunion across time. Her descendants had chosen her not just because she could receive their signals, but because she was the only one who could make this choice authentically. Only someone with a genetic and emotional connection to their future could decide whether their existence was worth preserving at the cost of changing the past. As Elena sat in that government facility, surrounded by officials who saw her only as a tool for their own ambitions, she understood that the most important decision in human history rested entirely on her shoulders. The future of human consciousness, the evolution of her species, and the fate of her own bloodline all depended on what she chose to do next. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, but Elena also felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in her life, she understood exactly why she had been born with her unusual abilities and deep love for the stars. Everything had been leading to this moment when she would have to choose between the certainty of he present and the possibility of an incredible future. Elena made her decision in the quiet hours before dawn, sitting alone in the communication room where everything had started. The government officials were asleep, confident that their prisoner would continue trying to reestablish contact according to their demands. They had no idea that Elena had been receiving messages all along, just not sharing them. She had spent 3 days thinking about the impossible choice her descendants had given her: save them and risk changing history, or preserve the timeline and let them fade into nothing. But Elena had realized there was a third option that no one had considered. Instead of trying to preserve her descendants' timeline or accept their guidance to change it, Elena decided to give the choice to humanity itself. She would share everything she had learned, not with government officials or military leaders, but with the entire world at once. Elena had been working on this plan for days, using her limited computer access to prepare a detailed account of everything that had happened, every conversation with the visitors, every piece of evidence from her grandmother's journal, every scientific detail about the time travel communications. She had packaged it all into a comprehensive report that would be impossible to ignore or suppress. At exactly 3:47 in the morning, the same time the first contact had occurred, Elena uploaded her report simultaneously to every major scientific institution, news organization, and social media platform she could access. She had used her credentials as a respected astronomer to ensure the information would be taken seriously, at least long enough for people to examine the evidence. The response was immediate and chaotic. Within hours, Elena's report was trending on every social media platform. News channels around the world were debating whether this was the greatest discovery in human history or an elaborate hoax created by a brilliant but unstable scientist. Religious leaders offered different interpretations of what contact with future humans might mean. Scientists demanded access to Elena's original data to verify her claims. But the most interesting responses came from ordinary people around the world. Families began sharing their own stories of relatives who had exhibited unusual abilities or claim to receive messages from unknown sources. Genealogists discovered patterns in bloodlines that seemed to match what Elena had described about her own family history. Elena watched the global reaction from her prison-like quarters, amazed by how quickly the information spread despite government attempts to control it. The officials were furious with her, but there was nothing they could do to stop the conversation that was happening worldwide. General Harrison stormed into her room on the second day after the release, his face red with anger. "You've compromised national security and possibly put the entire planet at risk," he shouted. "We don't know what these beings really want or whether they're telling the truth about being from our future." But Elena felt a strange sense of peace. She had given humanity the truth and let them decide what to do with it. Whatever happened next would be a collective human choice, rather than the decision of a few powerful officials in secret rooms. The most surprising development came 3 days later. Elena woke up feeling different, as if something fundamental had shifted in her body. At first she thought it was just stress from everything that had happened. But when the facility's doctor ran routine medical tests, the results were impossible to explain. Elena was pregnant. This shouldn't have been possible. Medical evaluations years earlier had concluded that Elena could never have children due to genetic complications inherited from her grandmother's side of the family, the same bloodline that carried the ability to communicate with the visitors. Apparently also carried reproductive issues that affected every generation. But the pregnancy was real and progressing normally. More surprising still, the unborn child showed brain activity patterns that were unlike anything the medical team had ever seen. The neural development was far more complex than typical human babies, with connections forming in areas of the brain that usually remained inactive until much later in life. Dr. Patricia Wong, the geneticist assigned to Elena's case, was fascinated by the readings. "It's as if the child's brain is already wired for abilities that humans don't normally possess," she explained to Elena during one of their sessions. "Mathematical processing, pattern recognition, and what appears to be sensitivity to electromagnetic fields that are far beyond normal human ranges." Elena understood what was happening even if the doctors couldn't. Her contact with the descendants from the future hadn't just been about preserving their timeline. It had been about ensuring the next step in human evolution would occur naturally, in the present timeline rather than being imposed from a distant future. The visitors had found a way to influence the development of Elena's child, while still preserving the natural flow of history. Instead of trying to save their own timeline by changing the past, they were ensuring that the evolution of human consciousness would continue in Elena's present, creating a new branch of possibility. As Elena's pregnancy progressed, the signals from the future began to fade completely. But this time, Elena understood that the silence wasn't because the visitors were in danger of being erased. They were withdrawing deliberately, allowing the present timeline to develop without further interference. 6 months after Elena's report had shocked the world, her daughter was born on a quiet morning in spring. The baby was perfectly healthy, but her eyes held an unusual depth of awareness that reminded Elena of her grandmother's stories about children who seemed to understand more than they should. as Elena held her newborn daughter and watched her. Tiny eyes tracked patterns in the air that no one else could see. She realized the true purpose of the contact. The visitors from the future hadn't been trying to preserve their own timeline or change Elena's. They had been ensuring that the chain of consciousness connecting all human experience would continue unbroken. Elena's daughter gurgled softly and reached toward the window where the first stars of evening were becoming visible. Her small hand moved as if she was greeting old friends, recognizing something in the cosmos that felt familiar and welcoming. The scientific community remained divided about Elena's claims, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. Other families around the world had come forward with similar stories spanning multiple generations. Researchers had documented unusual brain patterns in children born after Elena's revelation, suggesting that something fundamental was changing in human development. Elena knew that her daughter would grow up in a world where the boundaries between present and future, between human and cosmic consciousness, were no longer as fixed as people had once believed. The child would never have to feel alone when looking at the stars, because she would understand that she was connected to something vast and eternal. As Eleanor rocked her daughter to sleep that first night, she whispered the same lullabies her grandmother had sung to her decades earlier. But now she understood that those songs had always been more than just melodies. They were messages of love and connection that travel across time, ensuring that each generation would remember its place in the great chain of consciousness that linked all human experience. The first contact had been personal because the most profound connections always are. Elena had learned that the future of humanity wasn't written in distant stars or advanced technology. It was written in the bonds between generations, in the love that reaches across time to protect and nurture the continuing evolution of human consciousness. Elena's daughter would grow up knowing that she was part of something magnificent and eternal. And someday, when her own descendants looked back across the centuries, they would understand that every choice made with love creates ripples through time that ensure the continuity of everything that makes us human. The story had ended where it began, with a mother's love and a child's wonder at the infinite possibilities hidden in the darkness between the stars.